anybody who's not familiar with the name of Rosa Luxemburg might ask, why on earth are we celebrating a dead Polish woman who died 97 years ago? And, you know, I think, it's a good question, but Rosa Luxemburg wasn't just anybody. She was, as Lenin and Trotsky described her, an eagle, soaring high above her contemporaries. She was one of the leaders of the German social democracy in its heyday, and a theoretician of the left wing of that party. Her murder in the 15th of January 1919 was a tragedy for the success of the developing German Revolution at that time. Now, Luxemburg was born on March the 5th, 1871, a few days before the Paris Commune was declared in France, and I think 145 years ago today. She was born in a town called Zamość, in southeast Poland, the youngest of 5 children of a Jewish family. And when she was young, they moved to Warsaw, which is the capital of Russian Poland then. And at 5 years old, she had a serious hip ailment and had to stay in bed for a year. The misdiagnosis of that as tuberculosis led to her having a pronounced limp for the rest of her life. But despite this handicap, Luxemburg managed to get into the second girls' school in Warsaw, which was unusual given the very low quotas for Jewish students being able to get into school in Russian Poland, particularly good schools. It was here that she began to get involved in working class politics, and after eventually becoming known to the police, she fled to Zurich in Switzerland, where she continued her studies. And there she went from studying maths and natural science to law and political science instead. And in 1897 she received a doctorate in law for a piece on the development of capitalism in Poland. And it was while she was studying there in Switzerland that Luxemburg began to become known to the wider socialist movement. Luxemburg was one of the founder members of the Polish Socialist Party, PPS, and was on the editorial board of that party's paper. Yet when the party's new leadership adopted as its main demand the restoration of Poland, Poland had been divided between Germany and Russia and also the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so split in 3 parts, and they wanted, as a main demand, reunification. On the basis that Marx and Engels had supported it in their time, she and many in that organisation, especially those based in Poland, viewed that as a capitulation to bourgeois capitalist nationalism. And in her doctoral dissertation, she in fact attempted to show how Polish capital, big business, benefited from the subjugation of Russia, and that national independence was not necessary for the economic development of the country. Unlike many other annexed territories and semi-colonies which were deliberately kept in an undeveloped state. And in fact, she showed how the Russian autocracy had aided the development of Polish capitalism to try and undermine the feudal aristocracy there who'd been opposed to Russia taking over. She saw this as a progressive development, as it helped create a proletariat, a working class in Poland that would be the gravedigger of all the authorities, both Polish and Russian. Now, on the other hand, Lenin and people in the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, which was a party that united all socialists across Russia, including all the territories of the empire, they, on the other hand, stood decisively for the right of national self-determination. And in that they saw a tactic necessary to win the support of oppressed nationalities, especially in Tsarist Russia, where they formed a majority of the total population. There was more people living in all the colonies of Russia than in Russia itself. And by supporting this right, it removed obstacles pushing workers of those nationalities into the hands of the emerging national capitalists, and allowed the Bolshevik Party, which Lenin was a leader of, to try and bring the clash issues facing those workers to the fore. However, Luxemburg's experience within the PPS, who had uncritically advocated national independence and later ended up tailing the capitalist class and just supporting them uncritically, caused her to mistakenly reject that demand outright, believing that it would subordinate class struggle to the independence struggle, rather than seeing how the two things would intertwine, and both could only be fully resolved under the leadership of ordinary people, because it wasn't, as she correctly worked out, it wasn't in the interest of Polish capitalism to become independent of Russia. Now, obviously I'll sort of move on a bit. After attending a conference at the Socialist International, which is the body that brought together all the mostly European-based social democratic parties, the parties that had sort of developed from support of the idea of Marx and Engels, where the PPS leaders had blocked her and other people in opposition to the leadership's mandates. Rosa Luxemburg founded a new party called the Social Democracy of the Kingdom of Poland, later merging with a similar party in Lithuania, which was just next door really, which became known as the acronym of the SDKPIL, which I might have to refer to again, but Rosa Luxemburg became the outstanding national representative of that party and was present from then on pretty much at every single international meeting of the Socialist International, which was the kind of main body of socialists organised internationally. But she didn't stay in Switzerland very long. In 1898 she decided to move to Germany, because at that time Germany was home of the largest social democratic party in the world. But also at that time, a series of articles had been written by one of its leaders, the editor of the paper when they were in exile, when the SPD was illegal in the 1880s, who was a guy called Edward Bernstein, and he published those articles in the Newsite, which was the SPD's theoretical journal, which was, had substantial prestige. But in those articles, Bernstein argued that capitalism was overcoming its contradictions, and that socialism could be brought about by a gradual reform of capitalism. In France, André Millerand took this to its logical conclusion and took a ministerial post in a capitalist government. And this really was a significant attempt to revise Marx's theory. Yet the SPD leadership and Karl Kautsky, who was the editor of Newsite, and its main theorist, sometimes referred to as that time as a pope of Marxism, such was his standing, didn't take the controversy seriously at all initially. And therefore it fell to Luxemburg and others to begin the refutation of Bernstein's ideas in a series of articles. Luxemburg's were later published in a pamphlet, Social Reform or Revolution, and in that pamphlet she dispels the illusions Bernstein has in the things such as development of trusts and cartels, economic bodies that brought together different companies, as well as the expansion of credit, of loans and other things being available to companies to bridge crises. And actually what she does is explain how those things actually deepen the contradictions that run through capitalism and actually make crises much more serious in the long run. And she also takes up the idea that Bernstein's reformism was somehow compatible with the practice of the SPD, and I'll just read one quote from that pamphlet which I think illustrates that. And what she says is, legislative reform and revolution are not different methods of historic development that can be picked out at the pleasure from the counter of history, just as one chooses hot or cold sausages. Legislative reform and revolution are different factors in the development of class society. Every legal constitution is the product of a revolution. In the history of classes, revolution is the act of political creation, while legislation is the political expression of the life of society that has already come into being. Work for reform does not contain its own force independent from revolution. During every historic period, work for reforms is carried on only in the direction given to it by the impetus of the last revolution, and continues as long as the impulsion from the last revolution continues to make itself felt. Or to put it more concretely, in each historic period, work for reforms is carried on only in the framework of the social form created by the last revolution. Now, throughout this controversy, Luxemburg didn't neglect her commitments to the Polish workers' movement either. When workers struggling embarked on an upward curve across the Russian Empire, a conference was called to establish the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party on a firmer basis, and Luxemburg's party, the SDKPIL, sent delegates with a mandate to apply for affiliation to that party. Yet at the end of the conference, the RSDLP has split into what will become two distinct trends. The conference majority, the Bolsheviks, that's where that term comes from, it means majority, and the minority, the Mensheviks. The SDKPIL delegates had actually left the conference before that division, which took place on the seemingly minor issue of definitions of party membership. But what really lay behind this division was different concepts of how the party should function. A broad view hoping to organise all of the working class and their allies in a party in a looser form of organisation, on the one hand, contrasting with Lenin's view of a tighter knit organisation where members had more defined responsibilities and ultimately was more centralised. Whilst Lenin viewed his course as merely implementing basic social democratic ideas in the context of Russia, in reality he was creating a tendency which, despite being pulled closer to the Mensheviks at points of revolutionary upsurge, eventually became a separate party. And this division of the finally united party angered many of the leaders of the Socialist International, who sought for years to reunify them, including Luxemburg and Trotsky, who both were part of the RSDLP but stood outside the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. In her writings, Luxemburg actually rarely deals with organisational questions. To her, those were correctly secondary to political questions. Yet, she effectively left such questions of organisation to be resolved within the party over the course of events, rather than striving to give a lead. Both Luxemburg and Trotsky raised concerns over how centralised and tightly knit Lenin's conception of the party was. Yet this was related to the conditions in Russia, and tellingly, both Trotsky and Luxemburg eventually took a similar path. Now, despite her previous disagreements with Lenin and the Bolsheviks, it was to them that Luxemburg went to discuss the lessons of the 1905 Russian Revolution after she was released from prison in Poland, where she'd been arrested after she'd returned to Poland to support that. And there was a large degree of agreement on the fundamental lessons of the revolution, on which Luxemburg wrote another famous pamphlet called The Mass Strike, the Political Party and the Trade Unions, which is well worth a read. But alongside her previous differences with the Bolsheviks, out of this pamphlet and other things, there's been an attempt to create a theory of spontaneity, that was Luxemburg's strategy for revolution. In my opinion, she never developed such a theory. However, the spontaneous movement of the masses was emphasised by her in some of her works, such as The Mass Strike. But if you examine any movement, and this is what Luxemburg did, then it's never totally spontaneous. Of course, many protests and strikes can often not be called by political organisations, but that doesn't mean they're spontaneous. Often they can be influenced by the propaganda of various parties or organisations, but usually there's at least some discussion between those taking part in it beforehand about what to do, about where we're going to meet, what we're going to do when we get there, etc. There's usually some people who act as some kind of leadership, even if that's not a formal leadership in the same sense. But there's somebody who decides that's the place where we're meeting, that's what we're going to chant, that's what we're going to try and achieve. And whilst it can be argued that perhaps Luxemburg goes too far in equating a general strike with a revolution, she wrote the pamphlet and emphasised the spontaneity of the movement outside parliamentary channels, partially to stir up the conservative SPD apparatus out of its parliamentary routinism. Now, after that revolution took place in 1906, the SPD established a party school in Berlin to teach 30 students chosen by the party members, and the trade unions, a 6-month course on economics, socialism and other topics. And in 1907, Luxemburg was asked to take over the course in economics and remained doing that until the outbreak of the First World War. And here she tried to develop her ideas about political economy, particularly to try and intervene in the debate ongoing in the Socialist International about the cause of imperialist policy and colonialism. Unfortunately, in my opinion, her later theorising, she adopted the incorrect position that imperialism was due to the need to export commodities to expand capitalism, rather than being based on the need to export surplus capital, and as part of a trend towards monopolisation. Yet it was entirely the right problem to focus on. At the beginning of the 1900s, increasing tensions had developed amongst the major world powers. Proxy and trade wars took place in a number of areas, alongside the fear that the world could slide into a general conflagration, a world war, which obviously it did. Luxemburg correctly opposed those who believed that growing militarism wasn't intricately linked to the development of big business. Karl Kautsky, for example, even argued that the main task of social democracy was to support and strengthen the movement of the petty bourgeois, middle class, and the bourgeois, the capitalists, against war and the arms race. This was to be done through peace treaties and arms limitation agreements, rather than these being utopias under capitalism, which was Luxemburg's opinion. The only way for her to end war and militarism was to take power out of the hands of the capitalist class internationally. And the outbreak of the First World War marked one of the most shameful moments in the existence of the SPD. On the 4th of August 1914, the SPD's parliamentary group, which by then had become the largest in the Reichstag of the German parliament, voted for war credits for the German Kaiser King's army. This betrayal was mirrored by most of the other parties of the Socialist International. Famously, when the issue of Vorwärts, which was the SPD's main party paper, announced the decision reached in that parliamentary meeting, Lenin thought it was a fake, and the decision even surprised Rosa Luxemburg, who who, as we've seen, was much more aware of the degeneration that had been going on within the SPD than Lenin was, who was living in exile in Switzerland. Luxemburg always believed in the necessity of a revolutionary party, but in the face of a leadership that would not adopt a revolutionary policy, she belatedly began to organise a distinct revolutionary tendency, as the Bolsheviks had done in the RSDLP. And Luxemburg began to group around her SPD members opposed to the war. On the 10th of September 1914, a notice appeared in a couple of Swiss newspapers that there were SPD members opposed to the war, which was signed by Luxemburg, as well as Karl Liebknecht, who was the Reichstag deputy, who became the first to vote against war credits in December that year, but also party stalwarts such as Franz Mehring and Clara Zetkin. Clara Zetkin was the leader of the International Socialist Women's Movement, and that was a significant figure. Unfortunately, Luxemburg was sentenced for an anti-war speech that she made later on in 1914, was imprisoned the following year, February 1915. And it was only on New Year's Day 1916 that they actually officially formed a group called the Group International, which was formed in secret in Liebknecht's law offices. He was actually a lawyer before he gone into Parliament. And it later changed its name to the Spartacus government, or Spartacus League. Luxemburg was released from prison that month, and the group organised anti-war demonstrations with hundreds in Berlin on May Day 1916. And that led to the arrest of Liebknecht and further imprisonment without trial of Rosa Luxemburg. That group adopted another of Luxemburg's famous works called The Crisis in German Social Democracy, but otherwise known as the Juniors pamphlet, after the pseudonym that Luxemburg used to write it in, because obviously she couldn't have it printed under her own name given she was in prison and in theory shouldn't have been able to write that. But that pamphlet was a denunciation of the SPD's capitulation to the German king and to imperialism. And Lenin in Zurich wrote a very warm review of the pamphlet, saying, it's fantastic to see this, and so on, because it gave people real hope. Out of the kind of utter collapse of all these parties that were supposed to be anti-war, anti-militarism, who'd just lined up behind it. But Luxemburg remained, unfortunately, imprisoned, writing for the publication called the Spartacus Letters. That's why they changed the name to the Spartacus League. Until she was actually freed by the beginning of the German Revolution in November 1918. 2 years, over 2 years of imprisonment. And as events began to develop, she became increasingly frustrated at her isolation. In a letter to Sophie Liebknecht, Karl's wife, she comments, "I endured everything patiently through these past years and would, under other circumstances, remain just as patient for years to come. But after the general turnaround in the situation, a kink has developed in my psychology. Having conversations while being overheard by prison officials, the impossibility of talking about what really interests me, that is already so burdensome to me, that I would rather forgo any visitors until we can see each other as human beings." Now, shortly after she was released, and in the last months of her life, Luxemburg worked to build the Spartacus League. During that period of time, she played a key role in editing the organisation's daily paper, Der Farm, the Red Flag. The desperation of the Admiralty, who feared losing their prestige if Germany prepared to surrender without them taking part in the war, had led them to order a suicidal deployment of the German fleet into the North Sea. The sailors rebelled, refusing to stoke the ships, and linked up with workers in the port of Kiel, where the fleet was based. In panic, the SPD dispatched someone called Gustav Nosk to attempt to control the situation before the movement spread. But the combustible material was already present. People were fed up of this war, and the movement spread like wildfire across Germany. All sorts of bodies had been thrown up in the previous period. The SPD had split with a new group of Reichstag deputies refusing to vote for more war credits and formed the Independent Social Democratic Party, the USPD. Meanwhile, workers in Berlin, many of them USPD members, had begun to organise themselves independently of the official trade union structures, calling themselves the Revolutionary Stewards. With the revolutionary developments, they called for elections to workers and soldiers' councils. A Berlin council met 2 days later with a majority of SPD members, establishing the Council of the People's Deputies with an SPD president. For the time being, a tentative dual power existed of the masses in the streets alongside the official government. A national congress was scheduled for December where newly politicised workers and troops wanted an end to the war, supported the SPD, and ceded the council's powers to a soon-to-be-elected National Assembly. At its founding conference, at the founding conference of the Communist Party of Germany, which developed out in the Spartacus League, Luxemburg and other members of the leadership lost some votes to an ultra-left movement amongst the delegates, which included boycotting the upcoming elections to the National Assembly. No doubt they viewed the establishment of the National Assembly a retrograde step compared to the Council Congress, which had just been held literally weeks before. And undoubtedly it was. Hence the Bolsheviks dissolving the Russian Constituent Assembly on such a basis after they'd established the Soviet structure. But the KPD would have been best placed to take part in the election and put forward its ideas. That would have been best. And after the conference, Rosa Luxemburg hoped that this ultra-left move would disappear in the face of experience, that revolutions can take time to develop, and when there's a setback, sometimes that takes time to recover from rather than just kind of wishing it away. However, the SPD and army leaderships planned a provocation to crush that threat. Emil Eichhorn, who was a left-wing member of the USPD, the Independent Social Democratic Party, had been placed at the head of the Berlin police by the masses during the November Revolution. He was summarily dismissed from office by the SPD government, provoking a massive demonstration of workers opposed to this. A group of leaders of the Communist Party, of the USPD and of the Revolutionary Stewards launched a mobilisation of the workers with the aim of overthrowing the government, without any serious strategy as to how that would be achieved. Luxemburg opposed this, commenting to Karl Liebknecht, who'd been involved in the movement, "But Karl, what about our programme?" However, she decided that once the masses had been set in motion, the KPD couldn't abandon them. Both her and Liebknecht refused to flee the city, and on the 16th of January they were arrested and then murdered. Over the course of the next few months, several other KPD leaders were killed, and thus when German workers rose up again and again over the course of the next few years, all the way into 1923, they were deprived of some of their most outstanding leaders, with unfortunately disastrous results. A number of Luxemburg's writings, of course, weren't published until after her death. In particular, is a famed critique of the 1917 Russian Revolution, which she wrote about whilst in prison. And within the piece, Luxemburg critiqued several elements of the policies the Bolsheviks adopted after taking power, including their policy of distributing land to the peasants rather than statifying it, the dispersal of the Constituent Assembly in January 1918, and the adoption of the Red Terror in response to the Civil War, amongst others. Now, Luxemburg wrote this whilst lacking much detailed information, and for this reason never published it during her own lifetime. And in fact, she changed her mind on several, but not all of the criticisms she made. As her biographer, Paul Froelich, states, Rosa's aim was simply to warn the Bolsheviks about making a virtue of necessity, against laying down a detail about the tactics forced on them by fateful circumstances, and then recommending them to the international proletariat as moral socialist tactics worthy of emulation. In reality, several of the measures taken by the Bolsheviks were conditioned by Russia's backwardness, being a semi-feudal country with a huge peasantry, as well as the incipient civil war, with a regrouping counter-revolution based on the old aristocracy and others backed by the imperialist powers. In this situation, many of these things were necessary to take the revolution forward. In her article, Luxemburg comments that these were circumstances which were bound to have distorted any socialist policy, however imbued it might have been with the best intentions and finest principles. In another letter to fellow Polish revolutionary Adolf Warski, she points out the biggest limitation on the revolution. She says that truth holds good that even the greatest revolution can bring about only what is historically ready for fulfillment. This sore point too can only be healed by the European Revolution. And while she was favourable to the revolution, as she concluded her article with the words, "The future everywhere begins to Bolshevism." These writings wouldn't have seen the light of day if it weren't for Paul Levi, a KPD leader who broke ranks with the party over its mistaken tactics during the 1921 March action, but went and published that manuscript alongside other documents attacking the KPD at a time when it was under severe repression from the state. In the same article, entitled Notes to a Publicist, that Lenin condemns Levi's actions, he also criticises the KPD for not having yet published Luxemburg's collected works and made her ideas more widely available. In fact, even today, her collected works have only just started publication in English. There's only 2 volumes so far out. Yet there's a lot to learn from those writings that are currently available in terms of the strategy and tactics Marxists should adopt, alongside a theoretical defence of the key ideas of Marxism. And hopefully this discussion and others will make the lessons of her struggle accessible to people and help us to utilise those lessons in the struggle to build a socialist world.